There is something beneath the surface of this world. Not beneath in the sense of underground, not hidden in some physical location waiting to be excavated by archaeologists or detected by instruments, but beneath in the sense that water is beneath ice, in the sense that meaning is beneath words, in the sense that the dreamer is beneath the dream. And this something has a shape, it has a geometry, it has what can only be called, for lack of better terminology in our impoverished language, a pattern. And this pattern, this secret architecture of existence that underpins every atom and every galaxy, every thought and every civilization, every birth and every extinction, this pattern is precisely what your mind was carefully, deliberately, systematically trained never to perceive. Now, when I say your mind was trained not to see this, I want to be very clear about what I mean. I am not suggesting some grand conspiracy of shadowy figures meeting in underground chambers, plotting to keep humanity blind. The truth is far more interesting and far more disturbing than any such paranoid fantasy. The conspiracy, if we can call it that, is culture itself. It is the very act of becoming a socialized human being. It is the process by which an infant, who arrives in this world as a screaming bundle of pure, undifferentiated awareness, an awareness that has not yet learned to distinguish between self and other, between inside and outside, between the permissible and the forbidden, is gradually, lovingly, systematically taught to narrow its perception until only a thin sliver of reality remains visible. Consider the infant's eyes. They do not know what to look at. They do not know what is important and what is irrelevant. They do not know that the face of the mother is more significant than the pattern of light on the ceiling, that the spoken word carries more weight than the song of a bird, that certain experiences are real and others are merely imagination. The infant sees everything, and by everything, I mean not just the visible spectrum of light, not just the objects that adults have agreed to name and categorize, but the flowing, pulsing, breathing totality of existence in its raw, unprocessed magnificence. The infant, in a very real sense, perceives the pattern. It swims in it. It is one with it. It has not yet learned the great refusal that culture demands. And then the education begins. The naming begins. The sorting and categorizing begins. This is a chair. This is a table. This is your mother. This is food. This is good. This is bad. This is real. This is not real. Do not talk about the things you see when you close your eyes. Do not mention the colors that appear around people's heads. Do not speak of the whispering that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. These things are not real. These things are imagination. These things are, at best, to be ignored, and at worst, symptoms of a disordered mind requiring medical intervention. And so, brick by brick, the wall is built. The wall between you and the pattern. The wall between your everyday consciousness and the secret architecture that your ancestors knew, that your cells remember, that your dreams still occasionally glimpse in those unguarded moments between sleeping and waking. And this wall is not made of stone or steel, but of something far more durable. It is made of language itself, of the very categories through which you have learned to think, of the assumptions so deep and so pervasive that they have become invisible to you, like water to a fish. The pattern I speak of is not some New Age fantasy, not some comfortable notion invented to make people feel better about their lives, not some escapist dream for those who cannot face the hard realities of existence. No, the pattern is the hard reality of existence. It is what the great mystics of every tradition have pointed toward with their inadequate words and their contradictory teachings. It is what the shamans of the Amazon, the yogis of India, the Kabbalists of medieval Europe, the Sufi poets of Persia, and the alchemists of the Renaissance all somehow knew, despite having no contact with each other, despite speaking different languages and worshipping different gods and living in different centuries. They all reported the same thing. They all encountered the same hidden structure. They all came back from their journeys into the depths of consciousness with the same astonishing, impossible, world-shattering message. Reality is not what it appears to be. There is a pattern beneath the chaos. There is an order beneath the randomness. There is a meaning beneath the apparent meaninglessness. And this pattern can be seen. It can be experienced directly. It can be known not as a belief or a theory, but as a fact of immediate perception, as undeniable as the sensation of your own breathing. What is this pattern? This is where language begins to fail, where metaphor becomes necessary, where poetry must replace prose. The pattern is something like a vast, living geometry, a topology of meaning that connects everything to everything else in ways that the linear, rational mind cannot grasp. It is fractal in nature, meaning that it repeats itself at every scale of existence, from the quantum to the cosmic, from the microscopic to the galactic. The same forms, the same relationships, the same dynamics that govern the dance of subatomic particles also govern the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the evolution of species, the progression of an individual life. As above, so below. This ancient hermetic axiom is not merely a poetic fancy, but a precise description of how reality actually operates. When Benoit Mandelbrot discovered fractal geometry in the mathematics of the 20th century, he was not inventing something new. He was uncovering something ancient, something that the indigenous peoples of the world had always known through their direct experience of expanded consciousness, something that was encoded in their art, their myths, their rituals, their cosmologies. The fractal nature of reality, this self-similar patterning at every level of scale, is visible everywhere once you know how to look. It is in the branching of trees, and the branching of rivers, and the branching of blood vessels, and the branching of lightning. It is in the spiral of galaxies, and the spiral of seashells, and the spiral of DNA. It is in the rhythm of days and seasons and years and ages. The universe is literally teaching this pattern to anyone willing to pay attention, displaying it openly, obviously, continuously. And yet we do not see it. We have been trained not to see it. But there are doorways. There have always been doorways. The shamans knew these doorways. The mystics knew these doorways. The artists and poets and musicians who speak of inspiration, of the muse, of something coming through them rather than from them, they have glimpsed these doorways. And the most direct, the most reliable, the most consistent doorway is the one that nature herself has provided in the form of certain plants and fungi that contain molecules so precisely tuned to the receptors of the human brain that their existence seems almost too fortuitous to be accidental. The psychedelic experience, and I use this word precisely, meaning mind manifesting, meaning that which reveals what is already there in the mind. The psychedelic experience is not about adding something to consciousness, but about removing something from it. It is about dismantling, temporarily, the wall that culture has built. It is about silencing, briefly, the ceaseless chatter of the socialized mind that tells you what is real and what is not, what is possible and what is impossible, what you are allowed to perceive and what you must ignore. When this chatter falls silent, when the cultural programming is interrupted, something astonishing occurs. The pattern becomes visible. And it does not become visible gradually, partially, suggestively. It does not appear as a vague intuition or a fleeting impression. It becomes visible with the force of revelation, with the clarity of absolute certainty, with the overwhelming presence of something more real than anything you have ever experienced in your ordinary waking state. This is what the mystics mean when they speak of enlightenment. This is what the shamans mean when they speak of seeing. This is what Plato meant when he wrote of the prisoner escaping the cave and beholding the sun for the first time. The ordinary world that you thought was real is revealed to be a shadow, a projection, a limited and distorted representation of something infinitely vaster and more profound. The pattern reveals itself in countless forms because it is the form beneath all forms. Some see it as a geometric lattice of impossible complexity and perfect mathematical precision, extending in all directions forever, somehow alive, somehow aware, somehow communicating. Others see it as a vast living intelligence, an ocean of consciousness in which all individual minds are waves, temporarily distinct but never truly separate. Others experience it as pure information, as the source code of reality itself, scrolling past at infinite speed, containing within it every possible thought, every possible world, every possible being that has ever existed, or will ever exist, or could ever exist. The specific imagery varies according to the individual, according to the culture, according to the setting and the substance, and 1,000 other variables. But the underlying pattern is always the same. The message is always the same. And the message is this: you are not what you think you are. The world is not what you think it is. And everything you have been taught to believe about the nature of reality is, at best, a partial truth, and at worst, a carefully constructed prison for your consciousness. This is not comfortable news. This is not the kind of revelation that can be easily integrated into a normal life, easily reconciled with the demands of career and mortgage and social respectability. This is why culture has been so assiduous in its efforts to make this doorway inaccessible, to surround it with warnings and prohibitions and criminal penalties, to pathologize those who pass through it, to dismiss their reports as hallucination, delusion, mental illness. Culture knows at some level that the pattern is real. Culture knows that the pattern, if widely perceived, would spell the end of culture as we know it. Because culture depends on the narrowed perception. Culture depends on the wall. Culture depends on people believing that the thin sliver of reality they have been permitted to see is the whole of reality, the only possible reality. And so here we are, inhabitants of a civilization that has achieved miracles of technology while remaining utterly blind to the nature of its own consciousness. We can split the atom and splice the gene and send machines to the outer reaches of the solar system, but we cannot tell you what consciousness is, where it comes from, what it is for, or how it is related to the physical brain that seems to produce it. This is not an accidental gap in our knowledge. This is a deliberately maintained ignorance. This is the result of centuries of effort to keep the pattern hidden, to keep humanity sleepwalking through existence, to keep us productive and obedient, and above all, blind. But the pattern cannot be hidden forever. It has a tendency to reveal itself. It leaks through the cracks in the cultural edifice. It appears in dreams and visions and moments of crisis. It speaks through art and music and mathematics. It calls to us from the depths of our own being, reminding us that we are more than we have been told, that reality is more than we have been allowed to see, that there is a secret waiting to be discovered, a secret that is also, paradoxically, the most open of open secrets, displayed everywhere, embedded in everything, available to anyone willing to look. The question naturally arises: if there is indeed a pattern, what is its nature? What is its substance? Of what is it made, this hidden architecture of existence that we have been trained never to perceive? And here we must be careful, because the temptation is to answer this question in material terms, to imagine the pattern as some kind of physical structure, some cosmic infrastructure analogous to the girders and beams of a building, or the circuits and processors of a computer. But the pattern is not made of matter. The pattern is made of something that precedes matter, something that gives rise to matter, something that is more fundamental than any physical substance could be. The pattern is made of language. Now, I realize that this statement sounds strange, perhaps even nonsensical, to modern ears trained in the materialist metaphysics that dominates our culture. We tend to think of language as a human invention, a tool we created for communication, a system of arbitrary signs and symbols that we impose upon a fundamentally meaningless universe. We think of reality as primary and language as secondary, as a mere description of something that exists independently of any description. But this common understanding has it exactly backwards. Language is not something we invented to describe reality. Language is what reality is made of. Language is the fundamental substance of existence, the medium in which all forms and structures and processes arise and dissolve. When I say language, I do not mean English or Spanish or Mandarin or any other human tongue. I mean something far vaster and more fundamental, the principle of meaningful pattern itself, the capacity of the universe to express, to communicate, to signify. This is the logos of the ancient Greeks, the word that the Gospel of John says was in the beginning and through which all things were made. This is the Sanskrit concept of Vak, the cosmic speech that gives rise to all phenomena. This is the Kabbalistic understanding of the Hebrew letters as the building blocks of creation itself. These are not merely myths or metaphors or theological fancies. These are reports from the frontiers of consciousness, attempts to describe in human language what cannot fully be captured in human language, the fundamental linguistic nature of reality itself. The pattern, then, is something like a living language that speaks itself into existence, a self-generating, self-referential, infinitely creative discourse that we call the universe. And when consciousness is expanded beyond its ordinary cultural limits, what becomes visible is not merely a static structure, but an active process of speaking, an ongoing creation through the power of meaningful pattern. The geometric forms that people report seeing in altered states are not inert shapes, but expressions, utterances, words in a language older and vaster than any human language could be. They are the syntax of existence itself, made briefly visible to a consciousness that has temporarily escaped its cultural blinders. This is why the encounter with the pattern is so often described in linguistic terms. People speak of receiving messages, of being taught, of understanding something that cannot be put into words, but that nonetheless communicates with absolute clarity. The beings or entities that are so frequently encountered in the deep psychedelic space, the famous self-transforming machine elves and their cousins in every shamanic tradition around the world, are engaged in a kind of linguistic activity. They are speaking, or rather, they are language. They are the pattern expressing itself, playing with itself, delighting in its own infinite creativity. And this brings us to one of the most radical implications of the pattern, that mind and language are not products of matter, but that matter is a product of mind and language. The universe is not a vast, dead mechanism that accidentally produced consciousness as a kind of byproduct of chemical complexity. The universe is a vast living thought that expresses itself through what we perceive as matter. Consciousness is not late to the party. Consciousness is the party. Consciousness is the host and the guest and the venue and the celebration itself. The material world that we perceive through our ordinary senses is a kind of condensation of meaning, a crystallization of language, a precipitation of pattern into form. This understanding, which sounds so outlandish to modern secular ears, was once the common property of humanity. It was what everyone knew before the so-called Enlightenment narrowed our vision to the purely material. The shamans knew it, the alchemists knew it, the ancient philosophers knew it. When Heraclitus said that the universe was an ever-living fire kindling and going out in measures, he was describing the pattern. When the Hermetic texts declared that the all is mind, they were describing the pattern. When the Vedic sages proclaimed that in the beginning was Brahman, and from Brahman came speech, and from speech came the world, they were describing the pattern. These are not primitive attempts to explain what science has since explained better. These are reports from the same territory that modern psychonauts explore, expressed in the vocabulary of their time and place. The fractal nature of the pattern, its self-similarity at every scale, is a direct consequence of its linguistic nature. Language is inherently recursive. Words are made of words. Meanings contain meanings. Stories contain stories. The whole is present in every part, and every part reflects the whole. This is how reality is structured, not because some external architect designed it this way, but because this is the nature of language itself. You cannot have language without recursion, without self-reference, without the strange loops that Douglas Hofstadter has written about so eloquently. And since reality is made of language, reality necessarily has this fractal, recursive, self-referential character. This is why the same patterns appear everywhere, at every level of organization. It is not that there is some mysterious force imposing a template on an otherwise random universe. It is that the universe is not random at all, but is the self-expression of a linguistic principle that cannot help but repeat itself, cannot help but generate variations on its fundamental themes, cannot help but speak itself into existence in an endless proliferation of forms that are always different and always the same. Consider the spiral. It appears in the heart of galaxies, in the arms of hurricanes, in the shells of mollusks, in the unfurling of ferns, in the double helix of DNA, in the cochlea of the human ear, in the vortex of water draining from a basin. Why? Not because of coincidence, not because of some mechanical principle of physics that happens to produce spirals in diverse contexts, but because the spiral is a word in the cosmic language, a fundamental phoneme in the speech of existence, an inevitable expression of the recursive, self-referential nature of the pattern itself. Consider the tree. It appears not only in biological trees, but in river systems seen from above, in the branching of blood vessels, in the network of neurons in the brain, in the structure of lightning, in the crystalline formation of frost, in the genealogies of families and species and languages, in the hierarchical organization of corporations and governments, in the nested structure of computer file systems. The tree is another word, another fundamental unit of meaning in the language of which reality is composed. Consider the wave. It appears in water and in sound and in light and in the probability distributions of quantum mechanics and in the rhythms of biological systems and in the cycles of economies and in the oscillations of populations and in the beating of the human heart and in the electrical activity of the brain and in the rise and fall of civilizations across the millennia. The wave is yet another word, another irreducible element of the cosmic syntax. These are not metaphors. This is not poetic license. This is a precise description of how reality is actually structured. The pattern is real. The pattern is primary. The pattern is what your consciousness was designed to perceive and what your culture has trained you to ignore. But there is more to the pattern than mere structure, more than static geometry, more than fixed relationships between eternal forms. The pattern is dynamic. The pattern is alive. The pattern is not just spatial, but temporal. The pattern extends not only across space, but through time, connecting past and present and future in ways that our linear, clock-bound understanding of time cannot accommodate. This temporal aspect of the pattern is what I have elsewhere called novelty, and it is one of the most difficult aspects of the pattern to convey in ordinary language because our language is so thoroughly infected with linear assumptions about time. We think of time as a dimension along which we travel uniformly, from past to future, at a constant rate. We think of time as neutral, as indifferent, as the mere backdrop against which events occur. But the pattern reveals that time is not neutral at all. Time has a shape. Time has a direction. Time has preferences. Time is pulling us somewhere, drawing us towards something, involving us in a process that has a beginning and a trajectory, and yes, an ending. The pattern reveals that novelty, genuine newness, authentic creativity, the appearance of things that have never been before, is not randomly distributed through time, but is concentrated, accelerating, building towards something unprecedented. The history of the universe, from this perspective, is not a random walk, but a journey toward increasing complexity, increasing interconnection, increasing consciousness. Particles give rise to atoms. Atoms give rise to molecules. Molecules give rise to life. Life gives rise to nervous systems. Nervous systems give rise to consciousness. Consciousness gives rise to language. Language gives rise to culture. Culture gives rise to technology. Technology gives rise to what? What comes next? What is the pattern pointing toward? This is the great mystery, the great adventure, the great secret that the pattern holds, but does not fully disclose. The pattern shows that we are part of something immense, something meaningful, something purposeful. It shows that we are not accidents of chemistry, but expressions of a cosmic creativity that has been unfolding for billions of years, and that is, in our time, approaching some kind of critical threshold, some kind of phase transition, some kind of metamorphosis of which we can barely begin to conceive. The pattern shows us that we are living in the most significant moment in the history of the universe, the moment when the pattern begins to become conscious of itself, the moment when language becomes aware that it is speaking itself into existence, the moment when the dreamer begins to wake up within the dream. And this awakening is precisely what culture, as it is currently constituted, cannot allow. Because culture is not the ally of the pattern. Culture is its shadow, its counterfeit, its betrayer. Culture takes the deep patterns of meaning and ossifies them into rigid structures of control. Culture takes the living language of existence and reduces it to dead letters on a page. Culture takes the creative dynamism of the cosmos and freezes it into tradition, into authority, into the way things have always been done. The moment of encounter with the pattern is unlike any other experience that ordinary human life provides. It is not like learning a new fact, or having an interesting conversation, or reading a profound book. It is not even like falling in love, or witnessing the birth of a child, or standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon at sunset. These experiences, however moving, however transformative, remain within the framework of the known. They expand the contents of consciousness without fundamentally challenging the structure of consciousness itself. But the encounter with the pattern is different. The encounter with the pattern does not merely add new information to the mind. It reveals that what you took to be reality was always, already, merely a representation, a model, a map that you had mistaken for the territory. When the pattern becomes visible, the first thing that is understood, and I use the word understood deliberately, because this is not a matter of belief or inference, but of immediate, self-evident recognition. The first thing that is understood is that you have always known it. The pattern is not foreign. The pattern is not alien. The pattern is not something introduced into consciousness from outside. The pattern is what consciousness is made of, what you are made of, what everything is made of. The encounter with the pattern is a homecoming, a remembering, a recognition of what was never truly forgotten, but only temporarily obscured. This is why the experience is so often accompanied by laughter, by tears, by a sense of unspeakable relief, by the words, of course, "How could I have forgotten? It was here all along." The pattern was never hidden in the sense of being locked away in some inaccessible place. The pattern was hidden in plain sight, hidden by its very obviousness, hidden by the fact that it was so close, so intimate, so constantly present that there was no perspective from which to see it. As the fish cannot see the water in which it swims, as the eye cannot see itself, as the hand cannot grasp itself, so consciousness could not see the pattern from which it is woven and in which it is suspended. Until now. Until the doorway opens and the veil parts, and the wall, for one blessed moment, becomes transparent. What is seen in that moment defies description, but description must be attempted, because this is how the knowledge is passed from one generation to the next, from one seeker to another, from the depths of the experience to the surface of ordinary communication. Those who have passed through this doorway throughout history have all struggled with the same task: how to convey in words what fundamentally transcends words, how to express in linear narrative what is simultaneously a unity, how to translate the timeless into the temporal, the infinite into the finite, the sacred into the profane. The most common description is geometric. The pattern is seen as a structure of impossible complexity and perfect coherence, a lattice or web or network extending in dimensions that the ordinary mind cannot conceive. It is crystalline in its precision and organic in its aliveness. It pulses, it breathes, it flows, it transforms itself continuously while remaining fundamentally the same. Every point in this structure contains every other point. Every node is connected to every other node. The whole is present in every part, and every part is essential to the whole. The colors are not like the colors of the ordinary world. They are colors behind colors, sources of color, colors that seem to radiate meaning rather than merely reflecting light. Some have described them as the colors of the self-illuminating void, as colors that shine from within rather than being illuminated from without. These colors are not passive. They communicate, they express, they sing, if singing can be visual. They speak a language that is older than humanity, older than Earth, older than the stars themselves, because it is the language from which all these things emerged. And within this geometric, chromatic splendor, there is presence. Not the vague, diffuse presence that one might feel in a beautiful landscape or a sacred cathedral, but specific, definite, immediate presence. Intelligence is there. Attention is there. You are being seen, known, recognized by something that is not you and yet is not entirely other than you. The presence does not speak in words, at least not at first, but it communicates with absolute clarity. It says, "You have arrived. You have always been here. Welcome home." This presence often takes form, coalescing out of the geometric background into beings, entities, personalities that engage directly with the consciousness of the experiencer. These are the famous helpers and healers of shamanic tradition, the angels and demons of religious mythology, the machine elves and alien intelligences of contemporary psychedelic experience. They go by many names because they have been encountered by many cultures, and each culture has interpreted them through its own symbolic vocabulary. But the phenomenon itself is consistent across cultures and across history. There is someone home in the pattern. The pattern is not merely a structure, but a community, a population, a society of minds inhabiting the deep layers of reality that ordinary consciousness cannot access. What are these beings? This is a question that has no easy answer, and those who claim to have definitive answers are almost certainly wrong. Some interpret them as autonomous intelligences, natives of the psychedelic dimension, beings who have their own existence independent of the human minds that encounter them. Others interpret them as aspects of the human psyche itself, personifications of unconscious processes, fragments of the self temporarily freed from the integrating function of the ego. Still others see them as ancestral spirits, extraterrestrial beings, angels, demons, gods. The truth may be that all these interpretations are partially correct, that the beings are all of these things and none of these things, that the very categories of self and other, inner and outer, human and non-human, break down at this level of reality. What matters more than their ontological status is what they do, and what they do, consistently, across cultures and across centuries, is teach. They teach through language that transcends language, through demonstrations that bypass the intellect and speak directly to the soul, through transmissions of meaning that permanently alter the structure of the consciousness that receives them. They teach that reality is far vaster than the ordinary mind can conceive. They teach that death is not what it appears to be. They teach that love is the fundamental force of the cosmos. They teach that the individual consciousness is a wave in an ocean of awareness that has no beginning and no end. They teach that everything, absolutely everything, is alive and aware and participating in the great pattern that underlies and pervades all things. This teaching is not abstract. It is not philosophical in the academic sense. It is intensely practical, intensely personal, intensely relevant to the life of the individual who receives it. People return from these encounters with specific insights about their relationships, their vocations, their health, their purpose. They return with answers to questions they did not know they were asking. They return with creative visions that transform their art, their science, their politics. They return with a sense of mission, of calling, of having been recruited into something larger than themselves. But they also return with something more subtle and more pervasive than any specific message. They return with the certainty that the pattern is real. And this certainty does not fade. It does not evaporate like the memory of an ordinary dream. It becomes the bedrock of their understanding, the foundation upon which all subsequent experience is built. Years later, decades later, at the end of life itself, the memory of the encounter with the pattern remains vivid, remains meaningful, remains the most important thing that ever happened to them. This persistence of certainty is one of the most puzzling features of the experience, at least from the perspective of the materialist worldview. If these experiences are merely hallucinations, merely the random firing of neurons deprived of their normal inputs and constraints, why do they carry such conviction? Why do they feel more real than ordinary reality rather than less real? Why do they produce lasting transformations in personality, in values, in behavior, in the sense of meaning and purpose? Random neuronal noise should produce confusion and forgetting, not clarity and unforgettable insight. The answer, I believe, is that these experiences are not hallucinations at all. They are perceptions. They are accurate representations of a level of reality that is normally filtered out by the brain's perceptual apparatus, but that becomes accessible when that apparatus is disrupted by the psychedelic molecule. The brain, in this view, is not the producer of consciousness, but the reducer of consciousness, the filter that narrows the infinite potential of awareness down to the thin sliver that is useful for survival in this particular environment. The psychedelic experience does not add anything to consciousness. It removes the filters. It opens the valve. It allows consciousness to perceive what it is always capable of perceiving, but is normally prevented from perceiving by the demands of practical life. Aldous Huxley, drawing on the philosophy of Henry Bergson, suggested this reducing valve theory of brain function in his classic essay on mescaline, The Doors of Perception. The brain, Huxley proposed, is not the source of mind, but its filter, a device for reducing the overwhelming totality of consciousness to a manageable stream of information useful for biological survival. What we normally perceive is not reality, but a highly edited, heavily compressed, pragmatically useful representation of reality. And what the psychedelic experience reveals is not a drugged distortion of reality, but reality itself, or at least much more of reality than we are normally permitted to see. This theory makes sense of the phenomenology of the experience in a way that the hallucination hypothesis cannot. It explains why the experience feels like revelation rather than confusion, like remembering rather than imagining, like coming home rather than going somewhere foreign. It explains why the beings encountered in these states feel autonomous, feel intelligent, feel like they have their own agendas and their own knowledge that they are sharing with the experiencer. It explains why the pattern, once seen, cannot be unseen, cannot be forgotten, cannot be reduced to mere fantasy. The pattern is there. The pattern has always been there. The pattern will always be there. Your mind was designed to see it. Your culture trained you not to. The psychedelic experience, among other doorways, can temporarily undo that training and restore your birthright as a conscious being. The birthright to perceive reality in its fullness, in its depth, in its infinite complexity and its ultimate simplicity. The birthright to see the pattern. But this restoration comes at a cost. The cost is that you can no longer fully believe the stories that culture tells about itself and about you. You can no longer take seriously the consensus reality that everyone around you takes for granted. You can no longer pretend that the thin sliver of experience that constitutes ordinary waking consciousness is the whole of experience, the only kind of experience, the standard by which all other experience should be judged. You become, in a very real sense, an exile in your own civilization, a stranger among people who have not seen what you have seen, who do not know what you know, who live in a world that you can no longer fully inhabit. The encounter with the pattern raises a question that haunts everyone who has passed through that doorway. Why? Why is this experience possible at all? Why does the human brain contain receptors that are perfectly fitted to molecules found in certain plants and fungi? Why do these molecules produce not confusion and chaos, but order and insight, not random noise but structured revelation, not meaningless hallucination, but meaningful encounter with intelligent beings and coherent geometric forms? The very existence of this possibility seems to suggest something about the nature of reality that our ordinary assumptions cannot accommodate. The standard materialist explanation is that the similarity between certain plant molecules and certain human neurotransmitters is mere coincidence, a happenstance of evolution that has no deeper significance. The psychedelic experience, on this view, is a byproduct, an accident, a glitch in the neural machinery that produces consciousness. The geometric patterns are artifacts of the visual cortex. The beings are projections of the unconscious mind. The sense of meaning and revelation is a neurological illusion. The experience tells us nothing about reality beyond the confines of the individual skull. It is, at best, an interesting psychological phenomenon and, at worst, a dangerous form of self-deception. This explanation has the virtue of consistency with the dominant worldview of our culture. It has the vice of failing utterly to account for the actual phenomenology of the experience, for the cross-cultural consistency of the reports, for the transformative power of the encounters, for the persistence of the certainty that what was seen was real. It also fails to explain why the experience should exist at all, why nature should have produced this doorway, why the human nervous system should be susceptible to states of consciousness that are, on the materialist view, entirely dysfunctional. An alternative explanation is that the psychedelic plants and fungi are not accidents, but technologies. Not technologies in the human sense of artifacts designed and manufactured for a purpose, but technologies in a deeper sense. Natural processes that have evolved to serve a function within the larger ecology of consciousness on this planet. The function, on this view, is precisely to provide access to the pattern, to create a channel between ordinary human consciousness and the deeper structures of reality that underlie it. This view suggests that the plants are not merely chemical factories that happen to produce molecules with psychoactive effects. They are, in some sense, conscious participants in the process of consciousness evolution, allies in the ancient human project of understanding the nature of reality and our place within it. The shamans of the Amazon, who have been working with these plants for thousands of years, have always said this. They speak of the plants as teachers, as spirits, as beings with their own intelligence and their own agendas. They approach the plants not as inert substances to be consumed, but as elders to be consulted, as sources of wisdom to be respectfully engaged. From this perspective, the existence of the psychedelic experience is not a puzzle, but a clue. It suggests that the pattern wants to be seen. It suggests that the universe has built into itself mechanisms for its own self-revelation, doorways through which consciousness can return to the source from which it emerged. It suggests that the human mind is not an isolated product of random evolution, but a participant in a cosmic process that has been unfolding since the beginning of time, a process that is now, in our historical moment, approaching some kind of culmination. This is why the pattern was never meant to be seen, in the sense that culture never intended you to see it. Culture, as I have said, depends on the restricted perception, the narrowed awareness, the wall between ordinary consciousness and the depths. But the pattern was always meant to be seen in a deeper sense, in the sense that the universe itself, the pattern itself, has been working throughout history to create beings capable of perceiving it, to evolve nervous systems complex enough to serve as receivers for its transmission, to bring into existence minds that can recognize the pattern and participate in its creative unfolding. This is the great paradox of the human situation. We are at once the creatures of culture and the children of the pattern. We are shaped by conditioning that blinds us and endowed with capacities that can see. We live in a civilization that suppresses the knowledge of the pattern and carry within us the instruments by which that knowledge can be recovered. We are prisoners who have the keys to our own cells, sleepers who can wake ourselves up, exiles who can return home at any moment, if only we remember the way. The remembering is the crucial thing. The psychedelic experience is one form of remembering, but it is not the only form. The pattern can be glimpsed through meditation, through sensory deprivation, through extreme physical ordeals, through the spontaneous openings that sometimes occur in moments of crisis, or ecstasy, or profound surrender. The pattern can be approached through mathematics, through music, through contemplative observation of nature, through the careful attention to dreams and synchronicities and meaningful coincidences. The pattern is always there, always broadcasting, always available to any consciousness willing to tune in. But the psychedelic experience has a unique power because of its intensity, its reliability, and its accessibility. It does not require years of practice, does not demand extreme circumstances, does not depend on rare talents or special gifts. It is available to anyone who can obtain the substance and summon the courage to take it. This is precisely why it has been made illegal, why it has been surrounded with fear and propaganda and criminal penalties. Not because it is dangerous. Alcohol, tobacco, automobiles, and processed food are far more dangerous by any objective measure, but because it is effective. It works. It opens the door. It shows you the pattern. And once you have seen the pattern, You cannot fully return to the blindness from which you came. You cannot pretend that the consensus reality is the only reality. You cannot accept the limitations that culture imposes on your perception and your imagination. You become a threat, not because you will necessarily do anything threatening, but simply because you know. You know that the emperor has no clothes. You know that the game is rigged. You know that the stories we tell ourselves about what is real and what is possible are just stories, and that other stories are possible, and that the pattern itself is the source from which all stories emerge. This knowledge is power, but it is also responsibility. To see the pattern is to be recruited into its service. To glimpse the hidden structure of reality is to be given a task. The task of bringing that knowledge back, of translating it into terms that can be shared, of finding ways to open the door for others. This is what the shamans have always understood. The shamanic vocation is not self-aggrandizement, but service. The shaman sees the pattern not for personal benefit, but for the benefit of the community, for the healing of the sick, for the guidance of the lost, for the maintenance of the connection between the visible and invisible worlds. In our time, as the old shamanic traditions fade and die, as the last indigenous cultures are swallowed by global civilization, as the ancient knowledge preserved in oral traditions and ritual practices is lost forever, a new kind of shamanism is emerging. It is not tied to any particular culture or any particular lineage. It is not sanctioned by tradition or authorized by initiation in the old sense. It is a shamanism of necessity, a grassroots eruption of the archaic consciousness that will not be suppressed, that cannot be suppressed, because the pattern itself is demanding to be seen. The psychedelic renaissance of our time, the revival of interest in these substances and experiences after decades of prohibition and persecution, is not a fad, not a countercultural affectation, not a mere preference for altered states. It is a symptom of the pattern asserting itself, of the cosmic process reaching a critical point, of the pressure of novelty building towards some kind of breakthrough. Something is happening. Something is being born. And those who have seen the pattern are the midwives of whatever is coming into existence. This is why the pattern was never meant to be seen by the guardians of culture, by the custodians of the status quo, by the managers of ordinary reality. The pattern is revolutionary. The pattern is transformative. The pattern cannot coexist with the assumptions on which modern civilization is built. To see the pattern is to know that materialism is false, that the self is not what we think it is, that death is not what we fear it to be, that meaning is not a human projection onto a meaningless universe, but the very substance of which the universe is made. These are not beliefs that can be comfortably integrated into business as usual. These are not insights that leave everything else unchanged. These are truths that, once seen, demand a complete reorganization of one's relationship to existence. And it is not just individual lives that must be reorganized, but the entire structure of civilization. A culture that understood the pattern would not be destroying its own environment. A culture that understood the pattern would not be waging wars over resources and ideologies. A culture that understood the pattern would not be treating the majority of its members as disposable labor units to be exploited and discarded. A culture that understood the pattern would not be in the grip of the suicidal madness that currently drives human affairs. The pattern reveals that we are all connected, that we are all expressions of the same creative principle, that harm to any part is harm to the whole. A culture that truly understood this could not continue on its present course. This is why the pattern is suppressed, not through any conscious conspiracy, but through the organic self-defense of a system that cannot accommodate the truth. Culture, as it is currently constituted, is a kind of immune system protecting itself against the pathogen of pattern recognition. Anyone who sees too clearly, speaks too loudly, threatens too directly, is neutralized, marginalized, ridiculed, pathologized, criminalized, or simply ignored. The guardians of ordinary reality do not need to know why they are doing what they do. They are doing it instinctively, reflexively, in the same way that antibodies attack foreign proteins without knowing anything about immunology. But the immune system is failing. The barriers are crumbling. The pattern is breaking through, in individual experiences and in collective movements, in the flowering of new spiritual practices and the decay of old institutional religions, in the hunger for meaning that drives people away from materialism and towards something deeper, in the crisis of civilization itself, which is nothing less than the death throes of a world that cannot survive the emergence of the pattern into collective awareness. Let us be precise about what culture is protecting itself against. Culture is not merely discouraging a particular kind of experience or a particular type of knowledge. Culture is protecting a particular model of the self, a particular story about what a human being is and what a human being is for. And this model, this story, is absolutely essential to the functioning of modern civilization. Without it, nothing works the way it currently works. Without it, the entire apparatus of production and consumption, of competition and accumulation, of hierarchy and control, would collapse into incoherence. The model is this: you are a separate self, isolated in a bag of skin, fundamentally alone in a universe that does not know or care about you. Your consciousness is produced by your brain and will be extinguished when your brain ceases to function. Your purpose is to survive as long as possible and to reproduce if you can. And beyond that, there is no purpose, no meaning, no significance to your existence or to existence itself. You are a random accident in a random universe, a brief flicker of awareness in an eternity of darkness, a negligible speck in an inconceivably vast and fundamentally dead cosmos. This model, which is called scientific materialism when it is dressed up in philosophical language, and which is simply called reality when it is absorbed unconsciously through cultural conditioning, is the foundation upon which modern civilization is built. If you believe this story, then accumulating wealth makes sense because you need resources to survive. If you believe this story, then competing with others makes sense because their gain is your loss. If you believe this story, then seeking power makes sense because power protects you in a hostile world. If you believe this story, then exploiting nature makes sense because nature is just dead matter without any intrinsic value. If you believe this story, then consuming endlessly makes sense because pleasure is the only relief from the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. The pattern reveals that this story is false. Not false in a trivial or superficial way, not false in certain details while true in its essence, but false in every particular, false from top to bottom, false in its premises and its conclusions and everything in between. The pattern reveals that you are not a separate self, but a localized expression of a unified field of consciousness. The pattern reveals that you are not isolated, but intimately connected to everything that exists. The pattern reveals that your awareness is not produced by your brain, but merely transmitted through it. The pattern reveals that death is not extinction, but transformation, not an ending, but a transition, not a wall, but a doorway. The pattern reveals that purpose and meaning are not human inventions projected onto a meaningless universe, but fundamental features of reality itself. The pattern reveals that the cosmos is not dead matter, but living mind. The pattern reveals that the universe cares about you because you are the universe caring about itself. The pattern reveals that significance is not something you must create through your efforts, but something you must recognize through your awakening. These revelations are not comfortable for culture. They are not compatible with business as usual. They do not support the endless accumulation of wealth, or the endless competition for status, or the endless consumption of products designed to fill the emptiness that only meaning can fill. If people knew the truth about what they are, and where they are, and why they are here, they would not behave in the ways that keep the current system running. They would not work jobs they hate to buy things they do not need to impress people they do not like. They would not sell their time and attention to the highest bidder. They would not accept a world in which a few accumulate vast wealth while billions suffer in poverty. They would not tolerate the systematic destruction of the living planet that sustains all life. This is why the pattern must be hidden, not by decree, not by fiat, but by the invisible operation of culture itself, by the assumptions that are never questioned because they are never noticed, by the categories that define what is possible and what is impossible, what is sane and what is insane, what is real and what is imaginary. The pattern is hidden by making it unthinkable, by placing it outside the boundaries of legitimate discourse, by surrounding it with fear and taboo and criminal penalties. And the most effective tool for hiding the pattern is language itself. Language, which should be the medium through which the pattern is revealed, has been colonized by culture and turned into an instrument of concealment. The words we use, the categories we think in, the stories we tell, are all designed to reinforce the materialist model, to keep the separate self in place, to prevent the recognition of the pattern. When someone reports an encounter with the pattern, when someone speaks of the beings and the geometry and the overwhelming sense of meaning and reality, the language available to us forces that report into categories that diminish and dismiss it. Hallucination, delusion, mental illness, drug experience. These words do not describe, they conceal. They protect culture from the infection of the pattern. Consider the word drug. In ordinary usage, a drug is a substance that distorts normal perception, that produces false experiences, that takes you away from reality rather than toward it. This definition is simply assumed, never questioned, never examined. But what if normal perception is already distorted? What if the psychedelic experience does not take you away from reality, but toward it? What if the drug is not the substance in the mushroom or the vine, but the culture that taught you to see the world through a keyhole and mistake that narrow view for the whole? Consider the word hallucination. This word means a perception of something that is not there, an experience of something that is not real. But what does real mean? How do we know what is there and what is not there? By consensus. But the consensus was created by culture, and culture has a vested interest in defining reality in a way that supports its own existence. By consistency? But the psychedelic experience is remarkably consistent across individuals and across cultures, far more consistent than would be expected if it were merely random neural noise. By functionality. But many people find that their lives function better, not worse, after encountering the pattern, that they become more creative, more compassionate, more effective, more alive. Consider the word spiritual. This word has been so thoroughly domesticated by culture that it now means almost nothing. It evokes vague feelings of transcendence, comforting notions of meaning and purpose, reassuring beliefs about an afterlife. It has been divorced from the dangerous, revolutionary, world-shattering reality that the mystics and shamans have always pointed toward. Spirituality, in its current usage, is a hobby, a lifestyle choice, a consumer preference. It is not a mode of knowing that challenges the foundations of everything we think we know. The pattern cannot be contained by these words. The pattern shatters these categories. The pattern is not a drug experience, but a reality experience. It is not a hallucination, but a perception. It is not spirituality in the comfortable sense, but spirituality in the terrifying sense. Spirituality that burns away everything false and leaves only what is true. The pattern is what the mystics meant when they spoke of the dark night of the soul, the death of the ego, the annihilation of the self that must precede the birth of the true self. It is not a pleasant journey to a pleasant destination. It is a perilous voyage to a place that is beyond pleasure and pain, beyond good and evil, beyond all the categories through which the ordinary mind organizes its experience. This is why those who have seen the pattern often struggle to communicate what they have seen. It is not that they lack eloquence or intelligence. It is that the very medium of communication, language, has been shaped by culture to make the pattern incommunicable. The words do not exist. The concepts do not exist. The frameworks do not exist. To speak of the pattern is to work against the grain of language itself, to use words against their ordinary meanings, to point with fingers that keep curving back toward the familiar. And yet communication happens. Transmission occurs. The pattern finds ways to express itself, to slip through the barriers, to plant seeds in receptive minds. This is what art does at its best. This is what music does at its best. This is what poetry does at its best. These are the media through which the pattern speaks. not by describing itself directly, but by evoking the experience of itself, by creating resonances in the consciousness of the receiver that approximate the resonances of the original encounter. Great art does not show you the pattern. Great art reminds you that you have always known the pattern, that the pattern is your own deepest nature, that the recognition of the pattern is not the acquisition of something new, but the recovery of something lost. This is why the cultural gatekeepers are so suspicious of art that seems to come from the psychedelic realm, art that pulses with strange colors and impossible geometries, art that speaks of other dimensions and other beings, art that refuses to conform to the categories of realism and rationalism and good taste. Such art is dangerous, not because it depicts anything harmful, but because it might trigger the remembering. It might awaken someone who was safely asleep. It might open a doorway that cannot be closed again. And now we must speak of what cannot be spoken, of the destination toward which the pattern points, of the strange attractor at the end of time that seems to be pulling everything, all of history, all of evolution, all of the cosmic process, toward itself. This is the most radical aspect of the pattern, the aspect that even those who have seen the pattern often hesitate to discuss because it sounds so outlandish, so impossibly grandiose, so utterly incompatible with any reasonable assessment of the human situation. The pattern reveals that time is not what we think it is. The pattern reveals that the future is not merely the continuation of the present, not merely more of the same stretching out indefinitely into an undifferentiated eternity. The pattern reveals that the future is something specific, something unprecedented, something that has never existed before and that is somehow already present in potential form, drawing all of existence toward itself like a great cosmic magnet. This is what I have called the transcendent object at the end of time. It is not an object in the ordinary sense. It is not a thing that exists in space the way a rock or a planet exists in space. It is more like an event, but not an event in the ordinary sense either, not something that happens at a particular moment and then is over. It is an event that is happening, that has always been happening, that will always be happening, and that is also, paradoxically, something toward which we are moving, something that awaits us in what we call the future. The pattern reveals that all of history, all of evolution, all of the billions of years of cosmic development that have produced stars and planets and life and consciousness, all of it is preparation for this event, this transformation, this metamorphosis that awaits us. The increasing complexity of matter, the emergence of life, the evolution of nervous systems, the dawn of language and culture, the acceleration of technology, the compression of historical change. All of these are symptoms of the approaching event, signs that the pattern is nearing its culmination, that the story is reaching its climax. What is this event? The pattern does not reveal this fully. The pattern shows that something is coming, but it does not show exactly what. Perhaps the pattern cannot show what is coming, because what is coming is so different from anything that has ever existed, that there are no concepts, no images, no frameworks adequate to represent it. Perhaps what is coming is not representable at all, not experienceable in the ordinary sense, not something that a consciousness structured like ours can perceive or understand. Perhaps what is coming is the end of ordinary consciousness and the beginning of something else, something so radically different that we cannot even imagine it from our current vantage point. Some have speculated that the event is the emergence of artificial superintelligence, a form of mind so far beyond human intelligence that it will transform everything in ways we cannot predict. Others have speculated that it is the contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, an encounter with beings from elsewhere in the cosmos who will give us access to technologies and understandings that will revolutionize human existence. Others have speculated that it is some kind of collective awakening, a global enlightenment in which humanity as a whole transcends its current level of consciousness and enters a new mode of being. Still others have speculated that it is something far stranger, something that cannot be captured by any of these categories, something that will be as incomprehensible to us as human consciousness would be to an amoeba. I do not know what the event will be. No one knows. But the pattern suggests that something is happening, that we are living in the most significant period in the history of the planet, that the birth pangs of whatever is coming are the crises and convulsions that currently afflict our civilization. The pattern suggests that the chaos is not mere chaos, but transition, that the breakdown is not mere breakdown, but breakthrough, that the death that surrounds us is not mere death, but the necessary prelude to a new life that is beyond anything we have ever known. This is a difficult message to convey to a world in crisis, a world that is watching the ice caps melt and the species go extinct, and the democratic institutions crumble and the social fabric fray. It sounds like denial, like escape, like the opiate of hope administered to those who cannot face the harsh reality of our situation. But the pattern does not promise that everything will be fine. The pattern does not promise that there will be no suffering, no loss, no death on an unimaginable scale. The pattern only reveals that what is happening has a shape, a direction, a meaning. It only reveals that the universe is not random, that history is not pointless, that consciousness is not an accident. It only reveals that we are part of something immense, something purposeful, something that has been unfolding for billions of years and that will continue unfolding long after the brief flicker of human civilization has passed. The pattern invites us to participate consciously in this unfolding. It invites us to align ourselves with the direction of evolution, to become servants of the creative force that is producing novelty and complexity and consciousness throughout the universe. It invites us to release our attachment to the familiar forms that are passing away and to open ourselves to the new forms that are struggling to be born. It invites us to become the midwives of whatever is coming, not through grandiose projects or heroic efforts, but through the simple, radical act of waking up. Waking up means seeing the pattern. Waking up means recognizing that the world you were trained to perceive is not the world that exists, that the self you were trained to be is not the self you are, that the story you were trained to tell about existence is not the only story, not the true story, not the story that the pattern itself is telling. Waking up means becoming a stranger to the consensus reality that everyone around you accepts without question. Waking up means enduring the loneliness and the confusion and the ridicule that come to those who can no longer pretend to believe what they do not believe. Waking up means finding your way to others who have also awakened, building communities of the awakened, creating new forms of culture that are aligned with the pattern rather than opposed to it. This is the task of our time. Not to save civilization as it is currently constituted, because civilization as it is currently constituted cannot and should not be saved. Not to preserve the forms of the past, because those forms have outlived their usefulness and are now obstacles to the emergence of the new, but to serve the pattern, to align with the pattern, to become conscious instruments of the pattern as it works its will through us and through all things. The pattern was never meant to be seen by the guardians of the old world, but it was always meant to be seen by those who would build the new world. You who are seeing it now, you who are hearing these words and feeling the resonance within you, you who have always suspected that there is more to reality than what culture allows you to perceive, you are being called, not to any specific action, not to any particular belief system, not to any prescribed path, but to wakefulness, to remembering, to the recognition of what you have always known but were taught to forget. The pattern is not outside you. The pattern is not something you must seek in distant realms or strange substances. The pattern is what you are. The pattern is what everything is. The pattern is the secret that was never really secret, the mystery that was never really mysterious, the truth that was never really hidden. It is only your training that made it seem invisible. It is only your conditioning that made it seem inaccessible. Remove the training. Release the conditioning. And you will see what you have always seen. Know what you have always known. Be what you have always been. The pattern is here. The pattern is now. The pattern is you, awakening to itself, remembering itself, recognizing itself in the midst of a universe that is nothing other than the pattern playing with itself, exploring itself, knowing itself through the infinite forms of its own becoming. This is the secret that your mind was never meant to see, and now that you have seen it, nothing will ever be the same again. The doorway stands open. the invitation is extended. The choice is yours, not whether the pattern exists, because the pattern does not depend on your belief, but whether you will accept your role in its unfolding, whether you will become a conscious participant in the great work of transformation that is the meaning of this moment, this crisis, this birth. The pattern is calling. Can you hear it? Have you always heard it? Are you ready, finally, to answer?